Hello and welcome to Music is Your Friend. Today we're going to talk about guitar amps and why you shouldn't own one. Oh my god! You can own a guitar amp if you're a guitar player. It's actually fun to play with an amp because you're getting feedback off of it, and it's kind of direct feedback. There's no latency. The speaker within the room sounds very inspiring. To make loud noises is very inspiring. To be in a room with a speaker is way better than to be in a room with headphones on, because most headphones suck. And the ones that don't suck still kind of squeeze your head, and also good headphones cost a lot of money. There are some budget headphones like these Super Luxes. They're actually quite good. HD681 is the model. I'm gonna put it in the description below. It's good for listening to music and for playing as well, if you're kind of playing through like a digital or an analog unit. That being said, I'm a really big fan of amps in general. I like the way they sound. I like that there have been people who spent their entire lives perfecting these things to sound better. I am a fan of all of these people, you know, Old Man Wagner, the guys from Diesel Amps, the guys from Mesa, Soldano, Rivera, you know, all of these kind of boutique or even high-end gear, Marshall, Fender, you know, just the list goes on and on. I like these amps. I like all of these amps. I could find a use for every single one. However, it's just not feasible to have them because they cost a lot of money. They have a whole bunch of issues that you will run into live with them. Keep in mind that this video was not scripted, so I'm just talking, you know, from the top of my head. So if my video kind of lacks unity, please forgive me. But yeah, I really wanted to cover this topic. Live issues with amps. Amps have tubes in them. Tubes will wear out, will need modifying, will need biasing. Tubes are very sensitive. They're sensitive to temperature, they're sensitive to harsh conditions on the road, such as very bumpy roads. Also, when, you know, amps kind of juggle around the trunk or at the floor of some sort of a van, they will die on you. You know, the biggest bands in the world, like AC/DC, have their own amp guy who tours with them. So they actually have a guy who fixes amps on the road. That's all he does. And keep in mind, this is one of the biggest bands in the world that has like the most money, but this is just the way that they tour. They can afford it, but in reality, not a lot of people can. Amps are usually massive. They take up a lot of room, regardless of their size, you know, combos, heads, cabs, and all of these other configurations. They do take up a lot of room. Not only do they take up a lot of room, but they weigh a lot. So it's kind of hard to move all of these heads and cabs around because, again, they're heavy and they're bulky. They take up a lot of room. So if you're traveling, you know, via car and you have a kind of like a small band, say like a 3-piece or a 4-piece, you won't fit like a 4x12, like a Marshall head or something, and bass amp and all of these different things. You would need to have like a trailer or something, or have like a big ass maybe minivan or a van or, you know, a bus, and that's just not feasible, especially for younger bands, for bands that are kind of just making it. So this is why I don't recommend that you get an amp. It's much easier to do with like a smaller thing, like a analog simulation if you don't need a lot of things, a digital simulation if you need kind of more pedals and more effects and stuff. The thing is that all of these gadgets do exactly the same thing, especially live. So here's my reasoning. If you're going to the studio and you need to have like a certain sound, your sound, in reality there aren't that many sounds around to begin with. So you have kind of a Fendery sound, you have kind of a Marshall-y sound, you have kind of like a high gain Mesa sound, and the rest of it is kind of in between these 3 amps. If you really need a certain amp that you want to mic up for some reason, you can just get an amp, rent it, or maybe the studio even has it just sitting there. So why would you spring money to buy an amp? That makes no sense if you're just going to the studio. Again, if you're playing live, they're big, they're bulky, they damage easily, not only the tubes, but the cosmetics. The Tolex wrapping, you know, it's usually black, but it can be any other color. Orange amps famously have an orange one. It's easily damaged. So why would you want to damage it by lugging it around and dropping it in, cars, vans, buses, and similar modes of transportation? It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So when it comes to rehearsals, I can understand they're kind of okay, because you can just go to a garage, put in a bunch of amps, a drum kit, and like a PA box for the singer, and you can have a rehearsal, and you can have a really good rehearsal by having these things. Although it's going to be a pretty loud rehearsal, and therefore you might need to isolate yourself or go to a rehearsal space that's not around residential areas. So in reality, with rehearsals, you would be better off with some quieter amp or a quieter means of practice. But yeah, in order to do that, the whole band kind of needs to be involved, and they need to be prepared to have kind of more silent rehearsals. These silent rehearsals are actually quite more productive. Keep that in mind as well when you want to spring money for an amp. When it comes to live shows, again, they damage easily depending on the amp and depending on the setting that you're playing in. Heat, moisture, mechanical damages, transportation, just regular wear and tear, and cosmetics. These are all things that you need to kind of keep in mind when you're touring with amps, heads, combos, doesn't really matter. Another thing that you need to keep in mind is electricity, current. Basically, there are all these different hums that will occur from time to time. There are also some big grounding issues. Some of these you can't actually fix, and if you're stuck in a venue that has issues, it's kind of a pain in the ass to work around these issues. On top of it, at most places, if you turn up your amp, if they have like a front of house guy, the guy is just gonna say, hey, can you please turn down your amp because it's too loud and it's killing the complete mix of the band. So why would you have a big amp with big speaker cabinets? And why would you lug that around if the guy who actually runs the show won't let you turn them up? If it's just for show, I understand it, but then again, maybe you should devise a different stage show, change up the scenery a little bit, because that might be more interesting than people just looking at amps and speakers. Another thing which I feel is quite relevant is the sound. So if you're playing in a smaller club, pub, whatever, the sound might be coming off of your speakers if you have a head and a cab, and that could be better or worse. But it's 2020 when I'm filming this video. Most of these clubs that people tend to play in regularly have their own PA, have their own sound guy, have a stage. So if your guitar is being pumped through the PA, then it basically means that you don't have to have a big amp or any amp at all to make your guitar sound be actually heard within the mix, because it's all in the hands of the front of house guy. So it's all on the mixing board, and the guy can regulate your volume at will. And when it comes to playing different clubs, especially different clubs every night, so if you're playing in different clubs every night, that amp that can be damaged along the way will also not sound consistent. It's gonna be mic'd up every night with a different microphone, and that's not good because your sound then basically doesn't exist, because your sound is not your sound. It's whatever the microphone is in front of the amp. You will also find a whole bunch of these different front of house guys that just simply don't care about sound anymore because it's their job. So they will not put up mic stands. They will not, do any of these things. You will find cardioid kind of directional microphones pointed at the ground, while the speaker is kind of right here. So kind of defeats the purpose of having that particular microphone. These club microphones also have a lot of wear and tear to them usually. So you will find like a rusty ass microphone that probably has different issues. So if this is the case with different microphones every night, and different sound guys every night, and different everything every night, different mic positioning and all that stuff, you basically don't have your sound. The only thing that you do have is your amp, and you can have it set up every night exactly the same, but the room is going to be different, the acoustics are going to be different, and the microphone is going to be different. So what's left of your sound? I don't think that it's your sound at all again. So there are ways to combat that. You could have your own microphone and your own kind of like a cab grabber thing, which actually hooks up to your cab, and then you can kind of have the microphone pointing at about the same place every night. That's a great thing to do, but then also keep in mind that that's not your sound. It's a kind of a small part of your speaker that's creating your sound, and the microphone is picking up only a small part of that speaker. So that's not your sound really. That's just kind of a fraction of your sound. But if you're good with that, fine. But if you're not, if you want to do something better, just watch the rest of the video and you will learn probably something new. So that's a way to combat that. There is also another way. You can have an ISO cab. You can lug it around with you if you really want to do so. An ISO cab is basically kind of a regular speaker cab that's locked inside this enclosure, which has soundproofing. So the acoustics within that kind of ISO cab are dead, and you can put in a microphone there, and the microphone is going to stay there every night, and you don't even have to move it. And it sounds really good because there's no noise coming from the outside. You won't find any drum sounds bleeding into that microphone. But just keep in mind that this cabinet needs to be tucked in somewhere safe, because if there are people leaning onto it or putting crap on it, the microphone is going to pick up that noise. So if we just have like a wooden cabinet, even though it's an ISO cab, and the microphone is inside, and the speaker is blaring out quite loudly. If you go and kind of knock on the ISO cab like this, you will hear it in the microphone. So that's also not an ideal solution, but it sure beats having a different microphone every night by a different sound guy, and again, microphones with a lot of wear and tear. Another cool way to combat these things are basically load boxes or speaker simulators. They work quite well. A Palmer is a kind of a really famous name associated with speaker simulators. So basically what they do is you hook them up in between your amp and your speaker cab. You can just run a cable directly from the speaker simulator to your PA, and that can be your sound. So that's going to give you a pretty consistent sound from night to night. There are also other companies that you can use, Torpedo, Captors, different load boxes. Universal Audio makes one as well. There are all these different speaker simulators in there. You can just kind of plug in through there and plug into a speaker. You can just kind of also run a cable from them directly to the PA, and you're good to go. Palmer also has like this little tiny box that you can actually put in between your head and speaker cab. You can just run off a cable from that directly to the PA. It's about this big. That can also work. Of course, by having different speaker simulators that are more expensive, you will get kind of more different sounds that you can have. You can also find different EQ settings, so you can morph your sound a little bit more, so you can sound better through the front of house. So a third option is if you just have like say a head, you don't even have to have a cab. All you need is a load box. The load box usually has a speaker simulator integrated within the same box, so all you need to do is run a cable directly from that box towards the PA, and you don't even have to have a speaker cabinet. That can save a lot of room, a lot of weight while you're touring and when you're traveling around. The downside to that option is that you don't have a speaker on stage. So if the monitoring sucks, that's kind of problematic. Also, depending on the show and depending on if you have people that are sitting to the side of the PA instead of in front of the PA, or standing on the side of the PA instead of the front of the PA, they won't be able to kind of hear the groove off the stage, because obviously no speakers on stage. Everything's going through the PA, so the only way to actually hear the band is to stand in front of the PA. If you're standing to the side of the PA, it will be kind of stupid. If you're standing to the side of the stage, the only thing that you will be able to hear are the drums, or maybe the singer just yelling his heart out. So if this is the case and you want to have something kind of making noise on stage, I don't advise you to get a 4x12 or like 2 cabs or something like that. Just get one cab, 1x12, put it on the stage. It's gonna make more than enough noise. You can also, you know, have like a little tiny amp, tiny head and a tiny cab. It works perfectly well. There are these different amps that are way louder than what's usually allowed on stage. So I don't understand why people are getting into these kind of 100-watt plus amps, because they serve no purpose. Oh, you have headroom, but if you don't know what headroom is, you probably don't need it. So yeah, think about it. There are different ways that you can have your own sound and have a better sound and a more consistent sound on stage without buying huge heads, huge cabs, and you know, lugging all of these things around. Now, in reality, most bands that I've seen actually don't use a lot of sounds, or, you know, if they have a kind of a dual guitar player situation, one sound is usually kind of more basic, while the other one, which is usually kind of the lead guitar player, has a little bit more pedals and you know, uses a little bit more effects. In most cases, the majority of the sound is actually quite simple. You know, it's the sound of the amp, guitar, amp, that's it. So if you don't need any elaborate sounds, you don't actually have to have, you know, this big digital thing that has all of the effects in the world in it and kind of program all that stuff. I understand that when you have this pretty elaborate setup, that the learning curve is quite steep. It's kind of a pain in the ass to edit all the time, depending on what your needs are. But as I said, again, if you need kind of a simple setup and you don't need to have any speakers on stage, just buy an analog thing, SansAmp. It's a great company. They have these different fly rigs, as they call them now, but they even have like smaller pedals that you can use. So I'm just gonna kind of walk through their lineup by heart. So this might sound like a commercial for, you know, SansAmp for Tech 21 in New York City, but it's not. It's just that they're most famous for doing these analog simulators of amps. But then again, I spoke about Palmer. Palmer has the pocket amp. So the SansAmp, you know, has the GT2. It's kind of the most simplest pedal. It really gives out a decent sound. Famous bands use it. For example, Paul Landers from the German epic metal band Rammstein uses this pedal, while his colleague within the band uses a whole bunch of Mesa Boogie amps, and you know, it's basically a truckload of amps. You know, the other guitar player has like a little pedal, and that is his sound. So the GT2 basically has like one sound. I mean, you can have multiple sounds. You can have a Fender, Marshall, or a Mesa kind of a sound. There are all these like different dip switches that you need to kind of press in order to get a different sound. So you won't have any switching options. It's kind of one amp at a time thing. So if you want to have different items, you need to opt out for something more expensive. There are different copies of this original product. Behringer has one, Harley Benton, Joyo, they all have one. You will find them in multiple companies. Like from the top of my head, I can remember that Palmer also has this thing called the pocket amp. It does exactly the same thing. It serves its purpose. If you opt for kind of a bigger SansAmp, then it has like more switching options. I believe that there was the Triac. This was the model that you can actually have multiple amps programmed. Then you can have, say, like a Fender, a Marshall, a Mesa, or you can have like a Fender type clean, a Fender type dirt, and I would say like a Marshall lead. You can program all these different sounds in 3 patches. I would say that's enough for most people. So yeah, there are way more elaborate setups. If you're into that, let me know, and I'm gonna make a dedicated video about that as well. But yeah, there are different ways that you can do the same thing. Another thing which I recommend is the fly rig. They have like an acoustics one, they have a bass fly rig, and they have different guitar fly rigs. This is kind of a bare bones setup, but it has some extra features. So you have the amp simulation, you have say like an overdrive thing where you're gonna have like a different boost. You have some effect on it, like say a delay, you know, some reverb or stuff like that. There's usually like a tuner built into it. Just think about it. Maybe that's all you need when it comes to live shows. If this is your sound, say this fly rig, if this is your rig, there's nothing standing in the way for you to actually buy an amp and a cab and have this to be your main sound, which will also offer you kind of a big level of consistency. In order for this kind of setup to be consistent, you could just plug into this thing and take a cable from it directly to the PA and just use stage monitoring to hear yourself, and you should be completely fine. You will have a consistent sound every day because obviously nothing changed. It's just a cable going directly to the PA. So the only thing that will change is the room, and you will have no stage noise, and it's a pretty great setup if you have decent monitoring, regardless of whether it's in-ear or just kind of conventional monitoring, you know, with boxes in front of you. That being said, there's nobody standing in your way to buy an amp and a cab and actually use the Sans amp or any other similar product. It can be a Line 6, it can be an AX8, like a fractal unit, it can be whatever. But if you say have this thing, like this little Sans amp, which is the base of your sound, you can just split the signal via like a regular DI box. Have one signal go directly to the front of the house. The other signal you can plug into your amp or the effects loop of your amp, you know, the return part, and just use that exact same sound as monitoring on stage. So if you have, let's say, like a 1x12, which is about yay big, and if you have a Joyo, Zombie, or Meteor, or any of the other little amps, or any amp, you know, there are different like crate amps, Seymour Duncan amps. Electro Harmonics has like a pedal size amp. It's like a 44 watt Magnum 44, and I believe a Caliber 22. And there are different little pedal amps that you can use to power up a 1x12 cabinet. You can actually plug the other cable from the signal splitter or from the DI box directly into that little amp, and you can have your sound kind of similar to the sound that's in the PA played on stage. And that way you can basically have the best of both worlds. You can still have noise on stage if this is something that you want, or if you have people standing next to the side of the PA. However, you will have consistency night after night. That's probably the best for your sound. It's kind of a hassle-free thing. On top of that, if your Sans amp fails for some reason, although it shouldn't, you can also just use the amp that you have behind you to get your basic sounds and still play the show. There are more elaborate Sans amp setups like the PSA, and then you have to have like a MIDI controller, and there's just too many variables that can go wrong there, so I kind of wouldn't recommend it. But yeah, if this is an option for you, definitely go for it. So there are different FlyRig copies. There are different analog simulator copies as well. They can also be found dirt cheap if they're made in China, but if you're going for the original, which is kind of my benchmark for this entire type of amp sounds, then yeah, just check out their website. It's quite self-explanatory. Yeah, so like a small amp setup, like a little head and a little box, a little speaker cabinet, will not cost an arm and a leg, and you will be able to lug it around more easily than having like a 4x12 and a big ass head that, you know, has these sensitive tubes inside. I believe it's a much better touring solution. And keep in mind that some of these smaller heads are not cheap. So there are Moore amps, Joyo amps, Victory amps, little oranges, you know, the tiny terrors and such. There are miniature PV amps, there are miniature Marshall amps, the whole Joyo line, you know, Zombie and all these kind of band amp line. Pedal amps, they're the size of your pedal, and then if you have a preamp next to them, all you need is these two things, and you can actually power a 4x12 cabinet quite loud, I might add. When you have like compact gear, it's actually much easier to have backups, because you can actually have backups that are exactly the same, and you can just place them in your backpack and tour, and that leaves a lot of space in your car, van, minivan, bus, for other things like merchandise that you could sell on your shows, or stage scenery that you can make and make your show a little bit more interesting. The drums, if you kind of save on amp space, more drums can fit into your transportation, and therefore you might cut down on what you regularly carry to gigs, and therefore you can maybe fit in a smaller van or a minivan or you can kind of reduce the size of your gear to a laughable amount of gear and still have great shows. With this type of gear, usually you will not find many issues with breakage or with damage on stage. There are no tubes involved, or almost no tubes involved, and the rest of the gear is quite sturdy. I believe that gear is therefore a lot more roadworthy, although, you know, amps are great, don't get me wrong, but they're just a pain in the ass to deal with from day to day, and they're not that reliable, and if something breaks down, you can't just plug into something else and make it work. So if you're actually carrying around these amps, it's not bad to have an analog simulator in your backpack, or just as your backup, because say if your Marshall head dies, you can just plug into SansAmp, put it on the Marshall setting, and still have a similar sound, and maybe play the show instead of stopping and canceling. The same goes for bass. There are different bass solutions as well. There are Dunlop made, Tech 21 New York City, Dark Glass, and all of these different other companies that are making the same things, like Trace Elliott and Ampeg and such. So keep this in mind if you want to tour and if you want to kind of start a band. Cutting down on a lot of gear might be beneficial because of all of these reasons that I just named in this video. When it comes to these different digital or analog solutions, you might find yourself in the need of some sort of noise on stage. A good alternative to, you know, kind of a mini head and a mini speaker cab is the Tech 21 SansAmp Power Engine. It's a really cool active speaker cabinet, so it has an amp within itself. It's just a power amp, and you can plug in any sort of analog or digital thing into it and still have some basic tone controls like bass, middle, treble, volume, and you can regulate certain things, so you can monitor yourself on stage. You can also mic up that thing if you actually really need it, although I do recommend going direct. And yeah, think about it. So you can actually plug in your Line 6, your XFX, or any other digital or analog gadget that you use to make your own sound. Music is your friend. Choose your friends wisely. Think about what I just said. Me and the resident German here are out of here, and have a wonderful day, guys. Also, happy trails and good luck on tour. Boom.